In the hushed chambers of medieval workshops, where lamplight cast elongated shadows across vessels of strange liquors and powdered minerals, the alchemists labored not merely with fire and matter, but with an ambition that confounded the rational mind of their age. They spoke in riddles of a substance so paradoxical it could only be described through contradiction. The heaviest of materials that possessed no weight, the most common thing that none could find, the treasure buried in dung, the stone that was not a stone. This was the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, and the secret encoded within its impossible properties was not a formula for transmuting lead into gold, but a map of how consciousness itself undergoes radical inversion to achieve what the tradition called spiritual immortality. The true laboratory was never external. The crucible was the psyche itself, and the opus demanded not chemicals, but the willingness to turn one's entire understanding of existence inside out. The historical record preserves fragments of this great obsession, manuscripts filled with cryptic diagrams, allegorical poetry, and seemingly absurd instructions for combining substances that made no conventional sense. What drove these individuals, often at considerable personal cost, to pursue something that appeared preposterous to their contemporaries? The answer lies not in material greed, but in the recognition of a terrible truth about human existence. That the self we inhabit from birth, the identity we construct through social conditioning and ego building, is fundamentally inverted. It mistakes shadow for substance, periphery for center, death for life. The philosopher's stone represented the possibility of correcting this cosmic error, of achieving an orientation toward reality so radically different that it could only be described as a second birth, a resurrection into immortality while still breathing. But this immortality bore no resemblance to the naive fantasy of endless biological existence. The alchemists understood what depth psychology would later articulate with clinical precision: that the ego's terror of death is itself the cage that prevents authentic life. The stone promised not escape from mortality, but liberation from the ego's deathly grip on consciousness. It represented the achievement of a psychological state so integrated, so whole, that the usual fragmentation and conflict that characterizes human experience was transcended. This was the gold they sought, more valuable than any mineral precisely because it could not be possessed, only become. At the heart of this alchemical doctrine lies a principle that appears in various forms across the Hermetic tradition: the necessity of philosophical inversion. The work cannot proceed through accumulation or addition, through the strengthening of what already exists. It demands a fundamental reversal of the soul's orientation, a turning inside out of consciousness that requires not one but three distinct inversions, each more radical than the last. These are not metaphors for gradual improvement or spiritual advancement as typically conceived. They are descriptions of specific psychological operations that, when genuinely accomplished, produce a transformation so complete that the alchemists could only speak of it as the birth of the incorruptible body, the attainment of the stone itself. The first philosophical inversion concerns the relationship between above and below, between the celestial and the terrestrial, between spirit and matter. The uninitiated consciousness, the lead of common awareness, instinctively orients itself upward. It seeks transcendence through elevation, enlightenment through rising above the body, the passions, the messy entanglements of earthly existence. This is the solar ego at its most characteristic, striving always toward purity, refinement, separation from the corrupting influence of matter. The entire edifice of conventional religious aspiration rests upon this upward movement, this flight from the darkness below toward the light above, and it is precisely this orientation that must be inverted. The alchemists encoded this principle in the cryptic maxim, "That which is above is like that which is below." But this was not merely a statement of correspondence. It was an instruction for operation. The work begins not with ascent, but with descent, not with purification, but with putrefaction, not with the refinement of consciousness, but with its deliberate pollution through contact with what has been rejected, buried, denied. This is the stage the tradition names nigredo, the blackening, and it represents the first great inversion, the voluntary descent into matter, into shadow, into the prima materia that common consciousness experiences as worthless dung. This descent is not undertaken out of morbid fascination or philosophical curiosity. It is the recognition that consciousness, in its solar purity, is incomplete. The light of awareness, for all its clarity, casts shadows, and those shadows contain precisely what has been sacrificed in the construction of the ego. The personality we present to the world, the self-concept we defend, is necessarily partial. It has been built through exclusion, through the systematic rejection of qualities, impulses and potentials that did not fit the narrative of who we believed ourselves to be. These rejected contents do not disappear. They accumulate in the unconscious, forming what Jung called the shadow, a counter-personality that possesses all the energy and vitality that the ego has disowned. The first inversion requires a deliberate confrontation with this shadow material, not a casual acknowledgement of flaws or vices, but a sustained engagement with aspects of oneself that the ego finds genuinely threatening. This is the philosophical meaning of the alchemist's instruction to seek the stone in the most despised places, to find the treasure in what is rejected. The work demands that consciousness descend from its position of superiority and enter into relationship with its own depths. This is experienced phenomenologically as a darkening, a loss of certainty, a contamination of the bright self-image by qualities that appear base, primitive, unacceptable. What makes this a genuine inversion rather than mere self-examination is the requirement that the ego's orientation be fundamentally reversed. It is not a matter of the light shining into darkness to illuminate and thereby master the shadow. It is the recognition that the darkness possesses its own validity, its own intelligence, its own essential role in the completeness of the personality. The shadow is not evil to be conquered, but substance to be integrated. This requires a humbling of consciousness, a descent from the throne of judgment, an admission that the ego's perspective is partial and that wholeness requires the inclusion of what has been excluded. The alchemical texts speak of this stage in the most ominous terms. The matter turns black. It putrefies. It gives off noxious odors. The work appears to have failed completely. This is the phenomenology of ego confrontation with shadow. The self-image darkens. What was believed about oneself proves inadequate or false. Impulses and desires that were believed long conquered resurface with renewed intensity. The work of building and maintaining a coherent personality seems to unravel. The temptation at this stage is overwhelming, to retreat back into the solar position, to reassert control, to reimpose the old order through willpower and repression. But the first inversion cannot be completed through such retreat. It demands that consciousness remain in the darkness, that it endure the dissolution of its former certainties. This is not passive submission, but active engagement. The ego must learn to hold the tension between its former self-understanding and the shadow material that now demands recognition. This is the philosophical death the tradition speaks of with such emphasis. Something must die, but what dies is not consciousness itself, but consciousness's identification with the partial self it has constructed. The ego, in its inflated sovereignty, must be reduced, not destroyed, but rightfully sized, made aware of its dependence upon the greater totality of the psyche. The completion of this first inversion is marked by a specific psychological achievement. The ego's recognition that it is not the center of the personality, but rather a function within a larger system. This is the beginning of what Jung termed the individuation process, the slow and difficult work of becoming whole. The light does not disappear in this descent, but it is transformed. It becomes a light that can illuminate darkness without destroying it, that can see value in what was previously rejected. This is the philosophical gold, beginning to separate from the lead, but the work is far from complete. The first inversion has prepared the ground for an even more radical reversal. The second, philosophical inversion, concerns the relationship between inner and outer, between subjective and objective reality. Common consciousness operates under a largely unexamined assumption that the world outside the skull is real in a way that the world inside the skull is not. Thoughts, feelings, fantasies, dreams are private, subjective, essentially unreal. What matters is the external world of objects, events, and other people. This is the empirical orientation that has achieved cultural dominance in the modern West, the conviction that truth lies in objective observation, that reality is fundamentally material, and that consciousness is at best a secondary phenomenon, an epiphenomenon of neural activity. The alchemical tradition operated under a radically different assumption, one that depth psychology would later recover, that the distinction between inner and outer, subject and object, is not absolute but permeable, that the psyche itself is a kind of matter, possessing its own substantiality, its own laws of operation, its own forms of causation that cannot be reduced to external events. The alchemist's obsession with material operations was not naive confusion between psychology and chemistry, but rather a sophisticated understanding that psyche and matter participate in a continuum, that transformation in one realm necessarily involves transformation in the other. The second inversion requires a fundamental shift in where consciousness locates reality. The ego, having completed the first inversion and begun to integrate the shadow, now faces a more subtle task: to recognize that the contents of consciousness are not merely reflections of external reality, but possess their own autonomous existence. Dreams are not random neural noise, but communications from the unconscious. Fantasies are not idle entertainments, but the psyche's attempt to work through complex material. Emotions are not reactions to be managed, but data about the state of the interior system. Symbols are not arbitrary cultural constructions, but the psyche's natural language, arising spontaneously whenever consciousness attempts to grasp what lies beyond its current capacity for rational articulation. This inversion moves consciousness from an extroverted orientation, focused primarily on external adaptation, toward an introverted orientation, attending equally to the interior realm. But this is not solipsism or withdrawal into subjectivity. It is the recognition that the interior world possesses its own kind of objectivity, that it operates according to laws as rigorous as those governing physical matter. Jung's greatest contribution was perhaps his insistence on treating the psyche as an object of investigation, approaching inner contents with the same empirical rigor a scientist applies to external phenomena. The unconscious is not a metaphor. It is a realm of autonomous processes that can be studied, mapped, and in some degree understood. The alchemical operation corresponding to this inversion was called albedo, the whitening. After the darkness of Nigredo comes a clarification, a separation of elements, a washing away of impurities. Psychologically, this represents the development of what might be called interior vision, the capacity to observe psychic contents with clarity and discrimination. The ego learns to distinguish between its own interpretations and what is actually present in consciousness. It develops the ability to witness without immediately judging or intervening. This is the beginning of what the tradition called the subtle body or the inner witness, a position of consciousness that can observe the play of psychic forces without being entirely identified with them. This stage is marked by a particular kind of inner work that Jung called active imagination. This is not fantasy in the ordinary sense, not the ego's production of pleasant daydreams or dramatic scenarios. It is a disciplined practice of entering into dialogue with autonomous contents of the unconscious, allowing figures and images to arise spontaneously and engaging them as if they possessed independent existence, because they do. The anima or animus, the wise old man or great mother, the shadow in its personified forms, these are not creations of the ego, but archetypal structures that exist prior to individual consciousness, patterns through which the psyche naturally organizes experience. The phenomenology of this second inversion is one of deepening interiority. The world does not disappear, but it is increasingly experienced as symbolic, as meaningful in ways that extend beyond its literal surface. Synchronicities multiply, those meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained through mechanical causation, but seem to express some deeper connection between inner state and outer event. Dreams become vivid, portentous, demanding interpretation. The individual finds themselves drawn into an interior dialogue that becomes as real and demanding as any external relationship. This can be profoundly disorienting, particularly in a culture that grants no validity to such experiences. The danger of this stage is inflation, the ego's tendency to identify with the powerful contents it encounters in the unconscious. The individual who successfully navigates the first inversion and encounters the riches of the interior realm may be tempted to believe they have achieved special status, that they possess unique insight or power. This is a subtle form of the ego's attempt to reassert its sovereignty, to colonize the interior realm and claim its contents as personal achievement. The alchemical texts warn repeatedly against this premature assumption of mastery. The work is not complete. The ego has gained access to deeper layers of the psyche, but it does not yet possess the capacity to integrate what it has discovered. The second inversion is complete only when the ego achieves a balanced relationship with the unconscious, neither dominated by it nor attempting to dominate it. This requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity of consciousness to hold the tension between opposites without premature resolution. The ego learns to maintain its discriminating awareness while remaining open to contents that contradict or challenge its current understanding. It becomes a mediator between conscious and unconscious, between above and below, between the demands of external adaptation and the imperatives of interior development. This is the whitening, the clarification that allows consciousness to see clearly into both realms without losing itself in either. But there remains a third inversion, the most radical and most difficult to articulate. This concerns the relationship between self and other, between the individual ego and what lies beyond it. The first two inversions have transformed consciousness's relationship to its own depths and to the interior realm. But the ego, even in its chastened and expanded state, still maintains a fundamental boundary. It experiences itself as separate from what is not self. Other people remain truly other, the world remains external, and consciousness itself is experienced as occurring within the private space of individual subjectivity. This final boundary must be traversed for the work to reach completion. The alchemists encoded this final operation in their most mysterious and paradoxical symbol, the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. This was depicted as the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage between king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. But what exactly was uniting? Not merely different aspects of the individual psyche, though that is part of the process. The final inversion concerns the dissolution of the boundary between self and self, between the ego and the totality it serves. This is the stage called rubedo, the reddening, the final transformation that produces the philosopher's stone itself. This third inversion requires consciousness to undergo what can only be described as a death more profound than that of the first stage. In nigredo, the ego died to its inflated self-image. Here, the ego must die to its separateness, to its experience of itself as fundamentally isolated and alone. This is not ego death in the sense of psychotic dissolution or mystical annihilation. It is something stranger and more difficult. The ego's recognition that it was never separate in the first place, that its sense of isolation was itself a construction, that consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of skin and skull. Jung approached this territory with characteristic caution, recognizing both its psychological reality and the dangers of misinterpretation. He spoke of the self, using the capital letter to distinguish it from the ego self, as the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal. The self is not created through the process of individuation, but rather discovered, recognized, allowed to manifest through consciousness, rather than remaining hidden in the background. The ego's relationship to the self is analogous to the relationship between a planet and the sun it orbits. The ego is not eliminated, but finds its proper place within a larger system. But Jung went further, recognizing that the self as he described it participated in something that extended beyond individual psychology. The archetypes, those fundamental patterns of human experience, were not merely personal acquisitions or cultural constructs. They appeared to possess a transpersonal dimension, arising spontaneously across cultures and epochs, suggesting some kind of collective or universal substrate to consciousness. The distinction between psyche and matter, between inner and outer, between self and world, while pragmatically useful, was not absolute. There existed some underlying unity that expressed itself through the apparent multiplicity of separate entities. The third inversion invites consciousness to experientially recognize this unity, while maintaining the discriminating awareness that individuation has developed. This is the supreme paradox, to know oneself as both individual and universal, particular and cosmic, mortal and immortal simultaneously. The philosopher's stone, in its final definition, is consciousness that has achieved this integration, that can hold these opposites without collapsing into either pole. It is not that the ego expands to encompass everything in grandiose inflation, nor that it dissolves into oceanic merger, losing all capacity for agency and discrimination. It is that the ego comes to recognize itself as a particular manifestation of a universal process, unique yet connected, separate yet participating in a greater whole. The phenomenology of this final stage is notoriously difficult to articulate because ordinary language is built upon the very subject-object distinction that is being transcended. Those who have undergone this transformation speak in paradoxes and negations. It is like this, but not like this. It is nothing special, yet changes everything. The mystics call it union with God. The philosophers speak of cosmic consciousness. The Buddhists name it enlightenment or awakening. The alchemists, with characteristic precision, called it the achievement of the incorruptible body, spiritual gold, inner immortality. This immortality must be carefully understood. It is not the preservation of the ego's continuity after physical death, not the survival of personal consciousness in some afterlife realm. It is the recognition occurring within this mortal life that consciousness participates in something that is not subject to the ego's fate. The ego will die, the body will fail, the personality as we know it will dissolve. But the self that has been realized through the work of individuation is not identical with these temporary formations. It exists, if that verb even applies, in some dimension that is not subject to temporal destruction. Jung approached this territory with characteristic ambiguity, unwilling to make metaphysical claims that exceeded his empirical observations. But he recorded numerous cases of individuals who, as death approached, reported dreams and visions that suggested the psyche preparing for some form of continuation. Not wishful thinking or religious belief imposed from outside, but spontaneous products of the unconscious that seemed to know something consciousness could not rationally justify. He concluded that the psyche itself, in its deepest layers, operated as if death were not an ending but a transformation, as if consciousness participated in something that extended beyond individual existence. The completion of this third inversion produces what the alchemical tradition called the stone of the wise. Not a stone at all, but a state of being, a quality of consciousness that possesses stability and permanence amid the flux of circumstance. The individual who achieves this integration experiences a fundamental shift in relationship to suffering. Not that pain disappears or loss becomes easier, but that the ego's resistance to these experiences, its constant attempt to avoid and control, is seen through. Life continues with its full complement of difficulty, but the one who has achieved philosophical gold meets these difficulties from a center that cannot be shaken. This is the meaning of the alchemical claim that the stone renders its possessor invulnerable to illness and grants immortality. The illness in question is the disease of consciousness itself, the fragmentation and conflict that characterizes unrealized existence. The immortality is not of the body, but of that which has been realized through the body, the self that consciousness has learned to serve. The individual who completes the three inversions does not escape human limitation, but transcends the ego's tyrannical demand that limitation be eliminated. The social implications of this achievement are profound and troubling. The person who has undergone this transformation inevitably stands at some distance from collective values and assumptions. The first inversion, requiring integration of shadow, means the individual can no longer maintain the fiction of pure goodness that society demands. The second inversion, orienting consciousness toward interior reality, creates a split between individual experience and collective materialism. The third inversion, dissolving the boundary between self and other, produces a perspective that cannot be easily communicated to those who have not undergone similar work. This creates what might be called the loneliness of individuation. Not the loneliness of isolation or rejection, but the recognition that certain experiences cannot be shared, that the work of transformation is ultimately solitary. The alchemists worked alone in their laboratories, sworn to secrecy, communicating only through cryptic symbolism. This was not merely protective obscurity, it reflected the reality that the work could only be accomplished by the individual, that no teacher or tradition could do it for them. The most that could be offered was a map, symbols that pointed toward the necessary operations while concealing them from those not ready to undertake the journey. Yet the completion of the work carries with it a kind of ethical necessity. The individual who has achieved some degree of integration, who has brought shadow into consciousness and integrated the opposites, becomes a catalyst for transformation in others. Not through preaching or teaching in the ordinary sense, but simply through being what they have become. Consciousness that has achieved a degree of wholeness exerts a subtle influence on the collective field, raising the general level of awareness in ways that cannot be directly measured but are nonetheless real. This is the alchemical gold's true value, not personal possession, but contribution to the transformation of the world through the transformation of individual consciousness. The path of the three inversions is not one of comfort or security. It offers no escape from human suffering, no shortcut to happiness or fulfillment as conventionally understood. What it offers is something stranger and more difficult to describe. The possibility of living with full consciousness, of moving through existence with eyes open to both light and darkness, of embracing the whole catastrophe of human experience without either resignation or revolt. This is the stone's promise. And its achievement marks not an ending, but a beginning, the commencement of a life lived from center rather than periphery, from depth rather than surface. In the end, the three philosophical inversions describe nothing less than the complete restructuring of consciousness's relationship to reality, from identifying above as superior to below to recognizing their equality and interdependence, from privileging outer over inner to honoring the autonomous reality of psychic contents, from experiencing self as separate from other to recognizing the deeper unity that underlies apparent separation. Each inversion is a death, a dissolution of certainty, a descent into unknowing, and from each death emerges something new, some capacity that was not possible before, some integration that allows consciousness to hold what was previously unbearable. The philosopher's stone is not something one finds or possesses. It is what one becomes through the sustained work of transformation, the patient enduring of dissolution and reconstitution across multiple cycles of death and rebirth. It cannot be given or taught or purchased or inherited. It can only be achieved through the willingness to undertake the inversions, to turn consciousness inside out and discover that what one sought was never distant or external, but buried in the rejected depths of one's own being, waiting with infinite patience to be recognized and welcomed home. The gold you seek is not in some distant realm of transcendence, but in the shadow you have spent your life avoiding, in the interior world you dismissed as unreal, in the connections you believed yourself separate from. The stone of the wise is forged in the crucible of your own consciousness, through the fire of attention sustained against all resistance. And what emerges is not a thing to be possessed, but the recognition of what you have always already been, beneath the layers of constructed identity and defended ignorance. The treasure was never hidden. You were.